The Galactic Council's most spectacular failure wasn't the Great Nebula Tax Incident of 2387, nor the infamous diplomatic pudding disaster that nearly started 3 wars. No, their crowning achievement in cosmic stupidity was Form 42b, the official classification of Earth's dominant species as catastrophically unsuitable for Deathworld habitation. Yes, you heard that correctly. Humans were banned from Deathworlds, not because they were too weak, but because they were too dangerous. To themselves, apparently. The decision was made during what the Council's records diplomatically refer to as the Tuesday when everything went wrong. Ambassador Quillian Threshpike, a being whose evolutionary tree had clearly been pruned by natural selection's gentler cousin, had just finished reviewing humanity's application to colonize the volcanic hellscape of Mordak Prime. "Absolutely not!" Threshpike had shrieked, his 17 eyes dilating in what his species considered profound horror. These creatures breathe a corrosive gas that would kill most civilized beings in seconds. They consume liquids that would dissolve our ships, and they do it for fun. What Threshpike was referring to, of course, was oxygen, coffee, and the human tendency to find entertainment in activities that didn't involve sitting perfectly still in climate-controlled environments. The council chambers erupted in the kind of chaos usually reserved for announcements of tax increases or surprise inspections. Delegate Wampus Fizzlebottom, whose people had evolved in the gentle embrace of tidally locked planets with permanent cloud cover, actually fainted when someone mentioned that humans voluntarily exposed themselves to something called sunlight. "They have a recreational activity," whispered Councillor Neepthine Grabblemore, consulting his notes with trembling tentacles. "Called hiking. It involves walking up mountains, for no survival-related reason whatsoever." The gasps that followed could have powered a small space station. Dr. Wilhelmina Punchbowl, Earth's representative and the only human in the chamber, watched this performance with the kind of bewildered fascination usually reserved for discovering that your pet goldfish has learned to play poker. She had come here expecting to discuss mining rights and atmospheric processes. Instead, she was witnessing what appeared to be a collective nervous breakdown over the fact that humans enjoyed outdoor activities. "Excuse me," she said, raising her hand politely. "I think there might be some confusion here. We're not actually—" "Silence!" boomed Chairman Vorthak, the tremendously cautious, whose species had perfected the art of being afraid of their own shadows. Literally. They had developed technology to eliminate shadows altogether. "The evidence is overwhelming. Your species exhibits clear signs of pathological disregard for personal safety. But we're not. You have creatures on your planet," Vorthak continued, reading from a report that was apparently written in the galactic equivalent of crayon, "that you call pets, which your young play with, despite the fact that these beasts possess natural weapons such as teeth and claws." Dr. Punchbowl blinked. "You mean cats?" The resulting silence was so complete that you could have heard a pin drop if anyone in the chamber had been reckless enough to own something as dangerous as a pin. "The 4-legged assassination machines," Threshpike confirmed grimly. "Your records indicate that humans willingly share their dwelling spaces with these predators. Some even allow them to sleep in their beds. They're about this big, Doctor." Punchbowl demonstrated with her hands, and they mostly just knock things off tables and demand food. "Exactly," shrieked Councillor Blimpworth Ticklebottom, whose species had eliminated all furniture from their civilization after a tragic incident involving a particularly aggressive Ottoman. "Unpredictable behavior patterns, territorial demands, classical symptoms of apex predator psychology." And so, in a display of bureaucratic efficiency that would have made Kafka weep with joy, the Galactic Council passed Resolution 1001-X. The complete and total prohibition of human settlement on any planet classified as a death world, including but not limited to any celestial body featuring weather, topography, or atmospheric conditions that might cause mild discomfort to civilized beings. Dr. Punchbowl received the official notification 3 standard days later, along with a complimentary booklet titled, "So You've Been Classified as a Hazardous Species, a Survivor's Guide to Galactic Bureaucracy." The news hit Earth like a particularly polite meteorite. The initial reaction was exactly what you'd expect from a species that had once looked at the concept of fire and decided it needed improvement. Confused laughter, followed by an immediate desire to figure out how the whole thing worked. Professor Jasper Cranklebottom, Earth's leading expert in xenobiology and the only person who had actually read the Galactic Council's classification manual, called an emergency meeting of the Interplanetary Relations Committee. The meeting was held in his office, which smelled of old coffee and the kind of academic desperation that comes from spending too much time trying to make sense of alien bureaucracy. "Right," said Cranklebottom, adjusting his spectacles and squinting at a document that appeared to have been translated through several languages by a committee of well-meaning but linguistically challenged artificial intelligences. "According to this, we've been banned from all death worlds because we exhibit signs of what they call terminal biological optimism." "What the hell does that mean?" asked Dr. Penelope Snodgrass, the committee's expert in interspecies communication and the only person who had successfully learned to speak Galactic Standard without accidentally insulting anyone's mother. "Near as I can tell," Cranklebottom replied, "it means we're too cheerful about things that should kill us. They've got a whole section here about how we actively seek out dangerous situations for entertainment purposes. Apparently, the concept of extreme sports is considered a form of mental illness in most galactic civilizations." Dr. Reginald Binglesworth, who had spent the last 15 years trying to get funding for a research station on a planet where it rained sulfuric acid, looked up from his own copy of the classification manual. "They've listed exposure to solar radiation as a high-risk activity. That's just going outside." "It gets worse," Cranklebottom continued. "They've classified our entire planet as a Class 7 death world because we have something called weather patterns. Apparently, the fact that our atmospheric conditions change on a regular basis is considered a sign of planetary instability." "But that's just—" Dr. Snodgrass began. "Completely normal," finished Binglesworth. "Every planet with an atmosphere has weather. That's how atmospheres work." The 3 scientists sat in contemplative silence for a moment, each trying to process the magnificent absurdity of their situation. They had been banned from death worlds not because they were too weak to survive them, but because they were too eager to try. "Well," said Cranklebottom finally, "I suppose we'll just have to make do with the planets they consider safe for human habitation." Odzi, they spent the next hour reviewing the approved colonization list. It was not encouraging. The safe planets, as it turned out, were the galactic equivalent of cosmic nursing homes. Tidally locked worlds with permanent cloud cover, no weather patterns, no geological activity, and atmospheric compositions so bland that they made elevator music seem exciting by comparison. The most dangerous thing on these planets was the risk of dying from sheer boredom. "Look at this," Snodgrass said, pointing to a planetary survey. "Blandula Prime, average temperature exactly 22 degrees Celsius, no variation, ever, no seasons, no weather, no geological activity. The most exciting thing that happens there is a slight breeze every 3rd Tuesday." "What about this one?" Binglesworth suggested hopefully. "Mediocritas 7? Permanent overcast," Cranklebottom read. "Atmospheric pressure maintained at exactly 1 standard unit by artificial regulators. No native life forms above the complexity of moss. The planet's government has made it illegal to run anywhere because it might cause excessive heart rate elevation. They tried 17 more planets. Each one was more soul-crushingly safe than the last. Worlds where the biggest predator was a herbivorous slug that apologized before eating vegetation. Planets where the local governments had installed cushioned surfaces on all natural formations, taller than 12 inches, to prevent accidental injury. One world had actually made it illegal to look directly at their sun without protective eyewear, despite the fact that their sun was roughly as bright as a standard desk lamp. "This is ridiculous," Binglesworth exploded, throwing his hands in the air. "We're explorers. We're scientists. We're not going to spend the rest of human history sitting on climate-controlled planets watching moss grow." "So what do we do?" Snodgrass asked. Cranklebottom leaned back in his chair, a slow smile spreading across his face. "We do what humans have always done when faced with an impossible situation," he said. "We find a way to make it work for us." "And how exactly do we do that?" "Simple," Cranklebottom replied. "If they won't let us live on Deathworlds, we'll just have to build our own." The Project Terrarium proposal was submitted to the Earth Colonial Authority exactly 47 days after the Galactic Council's ban went into effect. The proposal was exactly 3 pages long, written in language so straightforward that even a government committee could understand it, and contained not a single mention of the real reason behind the project. The ECA approved it in record time, which is to say, only 6 months and 3 bureaucratic reviews later. The official project description read, "The construction of controlled environment habitats for the purpose of studying extreme atmospheric and geological conditions in a safe and regulated setting." What it actually meant was, let's build planets that are exactly as dangerous as we want them to be. The project team assembled at the Kepler Station construction facility looked like the kind of group that would have been assembled to build a monument to human stubbornness. There was Dr. Brunhilde Thwackbottom, an atmospheric engineer who had once terraformed a moon using nothing but industrial fans and sheer determination. Professor Nigel Bumbershoot, a geologist who specialized in making mountains where none had existed before, and Dr. Ophelia Crankshanks, a biologist who had spent her entire career figuring out how to make plants grow in places where plants had no business growing. "Right," said Thwackbottom, reviewing the construction plans. "We're building a planet that's dangerous enough to be interesting, but not so dangerous that it'll kill us before we can enjoy it." "Define interesting," said Bumbershoot. "Well," Thwackbottom replied, "weather patterns that change more than once a millennium. Geological activity that doesn't require a magnifying glass to detect. Maybe some actual topography instead of perfectly flat plains stretching to the horizon." "What about life forms?" asked Crankshanks. "Nothing that requires a safety briefing to look at," Thwackbottom decided, "but also nothing that apologizes for existing." The first prototype, designated Terra Nova Alpha, was built inside a modified space station roughly the size of Manhattan. The construction process took 18 months and involved the kind of engineering challenges that would have given normal species nervous breakdowns. They had to create weather, build geography, and establish ecosystems, all while maintaining the delicate balance between excitingly dangerous and actually survivable. The result was magnificent in its complete wrongness by galactic standards. Terra Nova Alpha featured actual seasons, real weather patterns, and geological formations that changed elevation by more than 6 inches. There were forests where the trees grew in unpredictable directions, streams that flowed at different speeds depending on recent rainfall, and mountains that had the audacity to cast shadows. The first test subjects were a group of human volunteers who had been specifically selected for their enthusiasm for what the Galactic Council would have considered pathologically reckless behavior. They were the kind of people who went camping for fun, who considered hiking a recreational activity, and who had never met a mountain they didn't want to climb. The test results were unanimous. Terra Nova Alpha was perfect. "It's got everything," reported Dr. Maximilian Whippersnapper, the project's lead test coordinator. Weather that changes, terrain that varies, plants that grow in different directions. It's like a real planet, but compact. The success of Terra Nova Alpha drew attention from an unexpected source. 3 weeks after the habitat went into full operation, the Kepler station received a diplomatic communication from the Galactic Council's Department of Hazardous Species Management. "We are requesting permission," the message read, "to observe human behavior in artificially constructed Deathworld environment, for scientific purposes only. We promise not to interfere with your clearly deranged activities." The message was signed by Ambassador Quillian Threshpike himself. Dr. Punchbowl, who had been promoted to Director of Interspecies Relations following what was now known as the classification incident, read the message with the kind of bemused satisfaction that comes from watching cosmic irony unfold in real time. "They want to watch us?" she asked Cranklebottom, who was serving as the project's scientific advisor. "Apparently," he replied. "They're curious about how we managed to survive in what they consider impossibly dangerous conditions, and they want to come here to observe? That's what the request says, though they're insisting on what they call appropriate safety measures." The list of safety measures that arrived with the formal observation request was 47 pages long and included requirements for atmospheric scrubbers, gravity dampeners, electromagnetic field generators, and protective suits that would have been suitable for exploring the surface of a neutron star. "They want to observe us in our natural habitat," Punchbowl mused, "while wearing enough protective equipment to survive in the vacuum of space. Should we tell them that what they're planning to observe is literally just people walking around outside?" "Oh, absolutely not," Punchbowl replied. "This is going to be wonderful." The first delegation of galactic observers arrived on a Thursday, which was entirely appropriate since the day of the week had been specifically selected for its potential to cause mild confusion among beings who organized their lives around perfectly predictable schedules. Ambassador Threshpike emerged from the diplomatic transport wearing what appeared to be a personal atmospheric processor crossed with a tank. His protective suit was so bulky that he needed assistance from 2 aides-de-camp just to move in a straight line. Behind him came a parade of scientists, bureaucrats, and observers, each wrapped in enough protective gear to explore a black hole. "Welcome to Terra Nova Alpha," Dr. Punchbowl said cheerfully. "We're delighted to have you here." Threshpike's response was barely audible through his suit's communication system, but it sounded like the kind of nervous whimpering usually associated with small animals hiding from predators. Is the atmosphere moving?" he asked, his 17 eyes focusing on a gentle breeze that was stirring the leaves of a nearby tree. "That's just wind," Punchbowl explained. "It's perfectly normal." "Normal?" Threshpike shrieked. "The atmospheric composition is changing. The pressure variations could cause catastrophic decompression." "It's about a 3-mile-per-hour breeze," Punchbowl said patiently. "You could literally stop it with a sheet of paper." The observation tour that followed was like watching a nature documentary narrated by beings who had never encountered nature. Every mundane aspect of the habitat was treated as a death-defying spectacle. A small hill caused 20 minutes of nervous discussion about unpredictable elevation changes. A stream triggered a crisis meeting about uncontrolled liquid dynamics. When a bird landed on a branch, 3 observers had to be physically restrained from activating their emergency evacuation procedures. "How do you survive this?" asked Dr. Blimpworth Ticklebottom, the Council's expert on habitability assessment. He was staring in horrified fascination at a group of human children who were playing what appeared to be a game of tag. "They're just playing," Punchbowl explained, "but they're moving at different speeds in unpredictable directions. That's how games work, and they're doing it voluntarily. They're having fun." The concept of fun required a 40-minute explanation and 3 emergency consultation calls to the Galactic Council's Department of Psychological Assessment. The real crisis came when the observers witnessed their first rainstorm. The weather management system had been programmed to generate realistic precipitation patterns, which meant that clouds could form, water could fall from the sky, and the whole process could happen without a 6-month advance warning and a comprehensive safety briefing. The first drops of rain caused what the official report would later describe as a complete diplomatic incident with mild hysteria. "Acid rain!" screamed Councillor Neepthine Grabblemore, activating his emergency shelter system. "We're all going to dissolve." "It's just water," Punchbowl said, holding out her hand to catch a few drops. "See? Completely harmless." She licked her palm to demonstrate. The observers' reaction was immediate and unanimous. 17 different species simultaneously activated their emergency medical protocols, 3 diplomatic aides fainted, and Ambassador Threshpike began rapidly dictating what sounded like his last will and testament. "She's consuming the acid rain," he gasped. "She's going to die." "I'm really not," Punchbowl assured him. "Humans drink water all the time. It's one of our basic survival requirements." "But it fell from the sky. It's been contaminated by atmospheric exposure." That's where all water comes from. The water cycle. Evaporation, condensation, precipitation. It's a completely natural process. The explanation of the water cycle required 2 emergency consultations with the Council's Department of Planetary Sciences and resulted in a formal request for human educational materials on basic atmospheric dynamics for species too terrified to go outside. By the end of the first week, the observer delegation had filled 17 reports, requested emergency psychological support for 12 of their members, and developed what their medical staff diagnosed as acute agoraphobia, with complications of atmospheric anxiety disorder. They had also, somewhat to their own surprise, become fascinated. "We don't understand," Threshpike admitted during a private consultation with Dr. Punchbowl. "Your species thrives in conditions that would kill most civilized beings within hours. You breathe corrosive gases, consume contaminated liquids, and expose yourselves to radiation that varies in intensity throughout your day cycle. And you do it happily?" "We do it normally," Punchbowl corrected. "This is just what life is like for us." "But why? Why don't you live in safe environments, controlled atmospheres, regulated temperatures, predictable conditions?" Punchbowl considered the question carefully. "Because," she said finally, "predictable is boring. We like surprises. We like challenges. We like the feeling of being alive in a world that's alive around us. Even though it's dangerous? Especially because it's dangerous. The danger is what makes it interesting." The concept of finding danger interesting was revolutionary by galactic standards. Most species had spent their evolutionary history trying to eliminate uncertainty, unpredictability, and anything that might cause mild discomfort. The idea that someone would voluntarily seek out challenging conditions was so foreign that it required an entirely new category in the Council's psychological assessment protocols. But there was something else happening in the observer delegation, something that their own bureaucracy was too rigid to recognize immediately. Some of the younger observers, the ones who hadn't yet been fully processed by their respective civilization safety protocols, were beginning to show signs of what their supervisors would have called dangerous curiosity. Dr. Zeffington Bingleberry, a young atmospheric scientist from the Perpetually Overcast Collective, had been caught removing his helmet for brief periods to experience what he called unfiltered air. Lieutenant Gromfington Wisbottom, a security officer from the hermetically sealed Systems Alliance, had been observed watching the rain without protective eyewear. Several others had been asking increasingly detailed questions about human recreational activities, particularly the ones that involved voluntary exposure to outdoor conditions. "Something's happening," Punchbowl reported to Cranklebottom during their weekly project review. They're scared, but they're also curious. Some of them are actually starting to enjoy being here. Define enjoy, Cranklebottom replied. Yesterday, I caught 3 of them trying to figure out how to make their own rain. They've been studying our weather patterns and asking questions about atmospheric dynamics. And Dr. Bingleberry actually asked if he could try walking on uneven surfaces without his stability assistance system. They want to try hiking. They want to try walking up a hill without mechanical assistance for no survival-related reason. Good Lord, Cranklebottom muttered. We've created monsters. The first request for extended observation privileges arrived 2 weeks later. It was submitted by Dr. Bingleberry, who had developed what his species would have considered a pathological interest in natural atmospheric variations. He wanted to stay for an additional month to study what he called the psychological effects of environmental unpredictability on cognitive function. What he actually wanted was to figure out why being outside made him feel so alive. The request was approved by the Council's Department of Hazardous Species Management after a bureaucratic review process that took 6 weeks and involved consultations with 17 different safety committees. The approval came with a list of additional safety requirements that was longer than most species constitutions. Dr. Bingleberry's extended stay was the beginning of what would later be known as the Deathworld tourism phenomenon. Within 6 months, Terra Nova Alpha had a waiting list of observers from dozens of different species, all requesting permission to study human behavior in what they continued to call impossibly dangerous conditions. The irony was not lost on anyone involved. Humans had been banned from Deathworlds for being too dangerous to themselves, and now aliens were lining up to experience what they considered the ultimate in hazardous living conditions, a mild climate with occasional weather variations. We've accidentally created the galaxy's most exclusive resort, Punchbowl observed during a staff meeting, for beings who think a gentle breeze is an extreme sport. Should we be worried about this? Asked Dr. Crankshanks, who had been dealing with increasingly complex requests for controlled exposure to plant life that grows in unpredictable directions. Worried? Punchbowl replied. We're about to become the most important species in the galaxy. We're the only ones who know how to build death worlds that don't actually kill anyone. The demand for human-built, controlled death world environments spread through the galaxy like a particularly polite wildfire. Within a year, Terra Nova Alpha had been joined by Terra Nova Beta, Gamma, Delta, and 17 other variations on the theme of pleasantly dangerous places, where civilized beings can experience the thrill of mild unpredictability. Each facility was designed to cater to different species' tolerance levels for what they considered extreme conditions. The perpetually overcast collectives facility featured weather patterns that changed as often as once per month. The hermetically sealed Systems Alliance's habitat included surfaces that weren't perfectly flat. The tidally locked Liberation Front's environment had a day-night cycle that varied by as much as 3 minutes over the course of a year. By galactic standards, these were death traps. By human standards, they were the cosmic equivalent of hotel lobbies. We've become the galaxy's adventure tourism operators, Cranklebottom reported to the Earth Colonial Authority. Species that have never experienced weather variations are paying premium rates to visit our facilities and experience what they call controlled exposure to atmospheric dynamics. How premium? Asked Director Wilhelmina Snodgrass, who had taken over the Colonial Authority following her predecessor's retirement to a nice, safe planet where the most dangerous thing was a slightly uneven sidewalk. Let's just say that we can afford to build as many of these facilities as we want, Cranklebottom replied. The waiting lists are backing up for decades. The success of the Deathworld tourism industry had an unexpected consequence. It was causing a revolution in galactic civilization. Species that had spent millennia avoiding anything that might cause mild discomfort were suddenly discovering that mild discomfort was actually interesting. The first signs of the revolution appeared in the younger generation of galactic citizens. These were beings who had grown up hearing stories about the mysterious humans who could survive in conditions that would kill normal people, and who had developed what their elders considered an unhealthy curiosity about what lay beyond the boundaries of their perfectly controlled environments. They started asking questions. Questions like, why do we live in environments where nothing ever changes? And what would happen if we turned off the atmospheric regulators for a few hours? And why is it illegal to go outside without full protective equipment when the outside is exactly the same as the inside? The questions led to experimentation. Young beings from across the galaxy began testing their own tolerance for environmental variation. They started with small things, adjusting their habitat temperatures by a few degrees, introducing minor variations in their lighting cycles, allowing their atmospheric pressure to fluctuate within what their safety protocols considered acceptable parameters. The results were unexpected. Instead of the catastrophic health problems that their medical systems had predicted, the experimental subjects reported feeling more alert, more engaged, more alive. It's like they're discovering that being comfortable all the time is actually uncomfortable, Dr. Punchbowl observed during a consultation with the Council's Department of Psychological Assessment. They're finding out that their bodies and minds are designed to handle variations, not perfect consistency. But that's impossible, protested Dr. Blimpworth Ticklebottom, who had become the Council's leading expert on what they now called human psychological dynamics. Our entire civilization is built on the principle of eliminating environmental stressors. Maybe, Punchbowl suggested gently, your entire civilization has been built on the wrong principle. The suggestion that their fundamental approach to life might be flawed was received about as well as you'd expect from a collection of species that had spent thousands of years perfecting the art of avoiding discomfort. The immediate response was a flurry of emergency committees, safety assessments, and strongly worded memos about the dangers of uncontrolled philosophical speculation. But the revolution had already begun. Young beings across the galaxy were discovering that their ancestors had been wrong about the fundamental nature of existence. They were learning that life didn't have to be perfectly safe to be perfectly wonderful. The movement had a name, the Controlled Environmental Variation Initiative, which was the kind of bureaucratic terminology that made revolution sound like a minor administrative adjustment. The HFY, as it came to be known, was spreading through galactic civilization like a virus of curiosity. "We've got a problem," Ambassador Threshpike announced during an emergency session of the Galactic Council. The younger generation is demanding access to what they call dynamic living environments. They want weather patterns, they want topographical variations, they want— He paused, struggling with the words. They want to experience what humans call the outdoors. "That's terrible!" shrieked Councillor Grabblemore. "If they start living in uncontrolled environments, they'll become as dangerously unpredictable as the humans." "It's worse than that," Threshpike continued grimly. "They're demanding that we reclassify our planetary safety standards. They want to redesignate Class 1 through Class 6 planets as environmentally understimulating and petition for access to what they call properly challenging habitats." The silence that followed was the kind of silence that usually preceded either enlightenment or complete civilization collapse. "They want to live on Deathworlds," whispered Dr. Ticklebottom. "They want to live on normal worlds," corrected Chairman Vorthak, whose species had developed the galaxy's most sophisticated system for avoiding having to make difficult decisions. "They want to live on planets where things happen." The revolution reached its tipping point when the perpetually overcast collective's Youth Council submitted a formal petition to their planetary government requesting permission to experiment with direct stellar observation during periods of atmospheric clarity. They wanted to see the sun. The request was denied naturally. The collective's safety protocols had classified direct stellar observation as a Class III hazardous activity, ranking it somewhere between uncontrolled atmospheric exposure and voluntary proximity to geological formations. The young beings' response was to organize what they called a stellar observation demonstration. 3,000 members of the collective's younger generation gathered in the planet's primary atmospheric processing facility and simultaneously requested temporary suspension of the artificial cloud cover. "Just for 1 hour," their spokesperson announced. "We want to see what our star actually looks like." The demonstration was peaceful, organized, and absolutely terrifying to the adult population. The idea that 3,000 young beings would voluntarily request exposure to unfiltered stellar radiation was so far outside the bounds of acceptable behavior that it required emergency consultation with the Galactic Council's Department of Civilizational Crisis Management. The consultation lasted 6 hours and concluded with a recommendation that was both revolutionary and inevitable. Maybe it was time to reconsider the definition of safety. "The humans," the report concluded, "appear to have been correct about something we never considered, that complete safety might not be compatible with complete sanity." The re-evaluation of galactic safety standards took place over the course of 18 months and involved the kind of bureaucratic soul-searching that hadn't been seen since the Great Taxation Reorganization of 2156. Every species in the galaxy was forced to confront the possibility that their entire approach to existence had been based on a fundamental misunderstanding of what made life worth living. The results were mixed. Some species, particularly those whose evolution had been shaped by genuinely dangerous environments, began cautiously relaxing their safety protocols. Others, whose entire civilizations had been built around the principle of eliminating risk, found the concept of voluntary danger so alien that they required extensive psychological counseling just to contemplate it. But the younger generation across the galaxy had already made their decision. They wanted to experience what humans had always taken for granted, the feeling of being alive in a world that was alive around them. The first naturally dangerous colony was established by a coalition of young beings from 17 different species. They chose a planet that would have been classified as a Class III Deathworld under the old system, a world with weather patterns, geological activity, and the kind of unpredictable environmental variations that had been considered impossibly hazardous just a few years earlier. The colony was a success. Not only did the colonists survive, they thrived. They developed new technologies, new art forms, and new ways of thinking that were directly inspired by their daily exposure to environmental challenges. They became more creative, more adaptable, and more innovative than their counterparts who remained in perfectly controlled environments. "It's like they're becoming more human," Dr. Punchbowl observed during a visit to the colony. "Not physically, but mentally. They're developing the kind of adaptability and curiosity that comes from living in a world that keeps surprising you." The success of the first colony led to a second, then a third, then dozens more. Within 5 years, there were more than 200 dynamic environment colonies spread across the galaxy, each one populated by beings who had chosen uncertainty over safety, challenge over comfort. The old guard of galactic civilization watched this transformation with the kind of horrified fascination usually reserved for natural disasters. Their entire worldview was being turned upside down by the revolutionary concept that life might actually be better when it wasn't perfectly predictable. "We've created a monster," muttered Chairman Vorthak during a private consultation with the Council's senior staff. The humans have infected our entire civilization with their pathological optimism. Is that necessarily a bad thing? Asked Dr. Ticklebottom, who had been conducting extensive research on what he called the psychological benefits of controlled environmental stress. They're enjoying themselves, Vorthak replied. They're living in dangerous conditions, and they're happy about it. It's unnatural. Maybe, Ticklebottom suggested carefully, natural is what we've been trying to avoid all along. The philosophical implications of this observation were staggering. If natural was good, then everything they had built their civilizations on was wrong. Every safety protocol, every environmental control system, every carefully regulated habitat was not a triumph of civilized engineering, but a denial of their own biological imperatives. The realization hit different species at different times and in different ways. Some embraced it immediately, enthusiastically dismantling their safety systems and rushing to experience what they had been missing. Others fought it desperately, clinging to their controlled environments and insisting that safety was more important than satisfaction. But the momentum was unstoppable. The revolution had become an evolution, and there was no going back to the old ways. The final irony came when the Galactic Council received a formal request from the human colonial authority. After watching the galaxy transform itself in response to human-built Deathworld habitats, humanity wanted to make an official application for reinstatement of their Deathworld colonization privileges. We've been thinking, Dr. Punchbowl explained to the Council during what would later be known as the reinstatement hearing. We appreciate all the interest in our artificial habitats, but we'd really like to get back to exploring real planets. You know, the kind with actual weather systems and genuine geological activity. The request was reviewed by the Council's Department of Hazardous Species Management, which had been renamed the Department of Environmental Diversity Assessment following the revolution. The review process took exactly 47 minutes, which was a new record for galactic bureaucratic efficiency. Application approved, Chairman Vorthak announced. Humans are hereby reclassified as environmentally adaptive and granted unlimited access to all planetary classifications. Thank you, Dr. Punchbowl replied politely. We're looking forward to getting back to exploring the galaxy. There is one condition, Vorthak added. What's that? We want you to take some of us with you. The request was not entirely unexpected. The galactic revolution had created a new class of beings, those who had discovered that they shared humanity's seemingly pathological attraction to environmental challenges. They were the cosmic equivalent of adrenaline junkies, except that their idea of extreme sports was living on planets where the weather changed more than once per geological epoch. We've been thinking, explained Dr. Bingleberry, who had become the unofficial spokesperson for what the media had dubbed the Galactic Adventure Seekers. Maybe we've been approaching this whole civilization thing backwards. Maybe the humans had it right all along. How so? Dr. Punchbowl asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Well, Bingleberry continued, we spent thousands of years trying to eliminate every possible source of danger, discomfort, or unpredictability from our lives. And what did we get? Civilizations full of beings who were bored, uncreative, and slowly going insane from the complete absence of any kind of stimulation. And now we've got entire populations of young beings who are more excited about life than they've been in recorded history. They're inventing new technologies, creating new art, developing new philosophies, all because they're finally living in environments that challenge them to grow and adapt. Deet, the transformation of galactic civilization had been remarkably rapid by cosmic standards. What had started as humanity's response to being banned from Deathworlds had become a galaxy-wide renaissance of curiosity, creativity, and what the academics were calling productive adaptation stress. The irony, Dr. Punchbowl mused, is that we never set out to revolutionize galactic civilization. We just wanted to build some planets where we could have decent weather. Sometimes, Bingleberry replied, the most important revolutions are the accidental ones. The joint human-alien expeditions to genuine Deathworlds began 6 months later. The first mission was to Hellscape 7th, a planet that featured active volcanism, unpredictable weather patterns, and the kind of geological instability that had made it completely off-limits to galactic civilization for over 2 millennia. The expedition team consisted of 12 humans and 36 aliens from 14 different species, all of whom had volunteered to experience what they called authentic environmental dynamics under human supervision. The landing was textbook perfect, which meant that something went wrong almost immediately. "Houston," came the voice of Mission Commander Tabitha Cranklebottom, Professor Jasper's niece and the expedition's lead environmental specialist. "We have a situation." "And a defined situation," replied Mission Control Director Reginald Bigglesworth from his position at Earth's Deep Space Communication Center. "Well," Cranklebottom reported, "the good news is that the planet is exactly as dangerous as advertised. Active volcanism, seismic activity, atmospheric pressure variations, the works. It's a genuine Class 7 Deathworld in every measurable sense. And the bad news? The alien team members are having what I can only describe as the time of their lives. Dr. Glorbington just tried to climb into an active thermal vent because he wanted to experience authentic geological processes. Lieutenant Humblefrizz is collecting samples of sulfuric precipitation because she thinks it's refreshingly unpredictable. And the entire, perpetually overcast collective delegation has been standing in direct sunlight for the past hour because they've never seen their own shadows before." "That sounds—" Bigglesworth paused, trying to find the appropriate word. "Wonderful." "It would be," Cranklebottom replied, "except that they're so excited about everything that they keep forgetting basic safety protocols. Yesterday, 3 of them tried to go swimming in a lava lake because they wanted to test their heat-resistant suits. I had to physically restrain Dr. Bingleberry from trying to pet what he called a magnificently dangerous indigenous life form. What was it? A poisonous snake, about the size of a garden hose. Completely harmless to humans, but it would have killed him in about 3 seconds. The communication from Hellscape 7 continued for another 20 minutes, during which Cranklebottom reported a series of incidents that would have been classified as diplomatic emergencies if they hadn't been so obviously the result of excessive enthusiasm rather than actual danger. "They're like children," she concluded. "Incredibly intelligent, technologically advanced children who have just discovered that the universe is much more interesting than they thought it was." The Hellscape 7 expedition was considered a complete success by every metric that mattered. The scientific data collected was unprecedented. The diplomatic relations between species had never been stronger, and most importantly, nobody died. Several expedition members did require medical attention for what the ship's doctor classified as acute excitement syndrome, but those were considered minor complications. The real impact of the expedition became apparent when the team returned to galactic civilization. The aliens who had participated in the mission were different. They walked differently, talked differently, and approached problems with a kind of creative confidence that their species had rarely exhibited before. "It's like they've been infected with humanity," observed Dr. Wilhelmina Snodgrass during a post-mission debrief. "They're exhibiting the same kind of optimistic problem-solving approach that humans use. They see challenges as opportunities instead of obstacles." "Is that bad?" asked Director Bigglesworth. "It's revolutionary," Snodgrass replied, "and revolutions tend to have consequences." The consequences began manifesting within weeks of the expedition's return. The aliens who had participated in the Hellscape 7 mission began advocating for similar expeditions to other authentically dangerous worlds. They founded what they called the Galactic Environmental Challenge Society, which was bureaucratic terminology for people who want to go places that might kill them. The GECS membership grew exponentially. Within a year, they had organized expeditions to 17 different Deathworlds, each one more genuinely dangerous than the last. The waiting list for expedition slots backed up for decades, and the application process became more competitive than admission to the galaxy's most prestigious universities. "We've accidentally created a monster," Dr. Punchbowl observed during a meeting of the Human Colonial Authority's senior staff. "A monster made of curiosity and enthusiasm." "Is that necessarily a problem?" asked Dr. Cranklebottom, who had been promoted to Director of Interspecies Expedition Coordination following the success of the Hellscape 7 mission. "It is when they start asking questions about why their own planets were classified as safe in the first place," Punchbowl replied. The questions had started innocently enough. Young beings across the galaxy began researching the history of their planet's safety classifications, trying to understand why their worlds had been designated as suitable for civilization, while others had been labeled as Deathworlds. What they discovered was troubling. "The classification system," reported Dr. Maximilian Whippersnapper during an emergency session of the Galactic Council, "appears to have been based not on actual danger levels, but on the psychological comfort zones of the bureaucrats who created it." "Explain," demanded Chairman Vorthak. "Well," Whippersnapper continued, "we've been reviewing the original planetary assessment reports, and it turns out that most of the worlds classified as safe weren't necessarily safer than the ones classified as Deathworlds. They were just more boring." "Define boring," said Councillor Grabblemore. "Planets where nothing interesting ever happened, no weather patterns to speak of, no geological activity, no environmental variations, no indigenous life forms more complex than moss." The classification wasn't based on safety protocols. It was based on the assumption that safe meant completely predictable. The implications of this discovery were staggering. If the planetary classification system was based on bureaucratic preferences rather than actual safety assessments, then the entire foundation of galactic civilization was built on a fundamental misunderstanding of what constituted a suitable living environment. "You're saying," Chairman Vorthak said slowly, "that we've been avoiding perfectly good planets because they were too interesting." "That's exactly what I'm saying," Whippersnapper confirmed. "We've got thousands of worlds that were classified as Deathworlds simply because they had weather systems, or topographical variations, or indigenous ecosystems. Worlds that would be perfectly suitable for colonization if you weren't afraid of experiencing mild environmental stimulation. The silence that followed was the kind of silence that usually preceded major historical turning points." "How many worlds are we talking about?" asked Dr. Ticklebottom. Whippersnapper consulted his notes. Approximately 14,000 planets were classified as Deathworlds based solely on the presence of uncontrolled environmental variables. Another 23,000 were designated as unsuitable for civilized habitation because they featured unpredictable atmospheric dynamics. "You mean weather," Punchbowl translated. "I mean weather," Whippersnapper confirmed. The revelation that galactic civilization had been avoiding 37,000 perfectly good planets because they had weather was received about as well as you'd expect from a collection of bureaucrats who had spent their entire careers justifying the unjustifiable. "This is preposterous!" shrieked Ambassador Threshpike. The classification system was developed by the galaxy's leading experts in habitability assessment. "Actually," Whippersnapper replied, consulting his research, "it was developed by a committee of bureaucrats who had never been outside in their lives. The original assessment team consisted entirely of beings from artificially climate-controlled habitats who classified anything involving natural atmospheric processes as inherently hazardous. But the safety protocols were written by the same committee. They classified direct stellar observation as dangerous because none of them had ever seen a sun. They labeled exposure to atmospheric movement as hazardous because they'd never experienced wind. They designated contact with naturally occurring precipitation as life-threatening because they'd never been rained on. The cosmic absurdity of the situation was becoming clear. Galactic civilization had been shaped by the equivalent of people who were afraid to go outside, making decisions about which planets were suitable for outdoor activities. "So, what you're telling us," said Chairman Vorthak, "is that our entire approach to planetary colonization has been based on the opinions of beings who were too terrified of the natural world to accurately assess it." "That's a fairly accurate summary," Whippersnapper confirmed. The bureaucratic response to this revelation was swift and decisive. They formed a committee to study the possibility of forming another committee to investigate the potential need for a comprehensive review of the existing committee structure that had created the original classification system. The popular response was more direct. Young beings across the galaxy began organizing expeditions to explore the forbidden worlds that had been classified as Deathworlds. They discovered planets with beautiful weather systems, fascinating geological formations, and ecosystems that were complex, interesting, and perfectly safe for anyone who wasn't afraid of experiencing nature. "It's like we've been living in cosmic nursing homes," reported Dr. Bingleberry during one of his regular broadcasts from the newly established colony on Sunshine 7th, a planet that had been classified as a death world because it featured a day-night cycle and seasonal weather variations. "All this time, we could have been living in places where things actually happen." The transformation of galactic civilization accelerated rapidly after the classification scandal broke. Colonies were established on hundreds of previously forbidden worlds. Trade routes were opened to planets that had been off-limits for millennia. Entire species began abandoning their sterile, climate-controlled habitats in favor of worlds where they could experience what humans had always taken for granted: the simple pleasure of living in an environment that was alive. "We've become the galaxy's life coaches," Dr. Punchbowl observed during a status meeting at the Human Colonial Authority. "We're teaching entire civilizations how to stop being afraid of their own universe. And they're learning fast," added Dr. Cranklebottom. "The latest reports show that productivity, creativity, and general satisfaction levels have increased by an average of 300% on worlds that have made the transition to dynamic environmental systems." "What about the holdouts?" asked Director Snodgrass. "Still clinging to their climate-controlled habitats," Cranklebottom replied. "But their numbers are shrinking every year. It's hard to argue for the benefits of complete environmental control when everyone around you is obviously having more fun without it." The holdout civilizations were facing a crisis of their own. Their younger generations were emigrating en masse to the new dynamic colonies, leaving behind aging populations that were increasingly isolated from the galactic mainstream. Some species were experiencing what sociologists were calling civilizational obsolescence, the gradual abandonment of their core cultural values by their own children. "They're not wrong to be concerned," Dr. Punchbowl admitted. "We have fundamentally changed the nature of galactic civilization. Whether we intended to or not, we've made safety-obsessed cultures seem antiquated." "Do you think we should be worried about that?" asked Snodgrass. "I think," Punchbowl replied, "that evolution doesn't ask permission before it happens." The final confrontation came from an unexpected source. The hermetically sealed Systems Alliance, one of the galaxy's most aggressively safety-oriented civilizations, had been watching the transformation of galactic culture with growing alarm. Their leadership had concluded that humanity represented an existential threat to their way of life, and they were prepared to do something about it. "The humans," declared Supreme Safety Coordinator Wompington Fizzlebottom during an emergency session of the Alliance's ruling council, "have infected our galaxy with their pathological disregard for proper safety protocols. They must be stopped." The Alliance's solution was characteristically bureaucratic. They would petition the Galactic Council to reinstate the original Deathworld classification system and ban humans from all planets, except those specifically designated as suitable for dangerously optimistic species. The petition was submitted with great fanfare and immediately ran into a problem. Most of the Galactic Council's member species had already adopted what they now called human-style environmental policies. The petition was reviewed by a committee consisting largely of beings who had recently discovered the joys of living on planets with weather and who had no interest in returning to the cosmic equivalent of padded rooms. "Petition denied," announced Chairman Vorthak, who had recently relocated his personal residence to a planet that featured actual seasons. "The Alliance is welcome to maintain their current safety standards on their own worlds, but they cannot impose those standards on species that have chosen to adopt more dynamic approaches to environmental management." The Alliance's response was to threaten withdrawal from the Galactic Council entirely. "Fine," Vorthak replied cheerfully. "We'll miss you." The Alliance's threat to withdraw from galactic civilization was called what it was: a bluff. They were far too dependent on trade with the dynamic colonies to actually isolate themselves completely, but they were serious about their opposition to what they called the human contamination of galactic safety culture. Their solution was to organize what they called a safety intervention. The plan was to demonstrate the inherent dangers of human-style environmental policies by documenting the inevitable catastrophic failures that would result from living on worlds with weather patterns. The Alliance assembled a team of safety inspectors, risk assessment specialists, and disaster prediction experts, and dispatched them to the most successful of the human-influenced colonies. Their mission was to compile evidence of the terrible consequences of abandoning proper safety protocols. The mission was a complete failure. "We can't find any disasters," reported Chief Safety Inspector Grompington Wisbottom after 3 months of intensive investigation. "The colonies are thriving. Accident rates are actually lower than they are on traditional climate-controlled worlds. The colonists are healthier, happier, and more productive than our statistical models suggested was possible." "That's impossible," protested Coordinator Fizzlebottom. "They're living in uncontrolled environments. There should be catastrophic failures everywhere." "There aren't," Wisbottom replied. "In fact, the opposite is true. The colonists have developed better emergency response systems, more effective resource management protocols, and stronger community cooperation networks than most traditional settlements. It's like living in challenging environments has made them better at everything." The Alliance's investigation had backfired spectacularly. Instead of documenting the failures of human-style environmental policies, they had produced the most comprehensive study ever conducted on the benefits of what academics were now calling adaptive environmental integration. "The humans were right," Wisbottom concluded in his final report. "Complete safety isn't safe at all. It's a form of slow death that kills everything that makes life worth living." The Alliance's response to their own investigators' report was to classify it as dangerous misinformation and order its suppression. But it was too late. The report had already been distributed throughout the galactic communication networks, and its conclusions were being discussed in every civilized system. "The holdouts are running out of arguments," Dr. Punchbowl observed during a meeting of the Human Colonial Authority's senior staff. "They can't deny the evidence anymore. Human-style environmental policies work better than traditional safety protocols in every measurable way." "So what happens now?" asked Director Snodgrass. "Now," Punchbowl replied, "we find out what the universe looks like when an entire galactic civilization decides to stop being afraid of itself." The transformation was remarkably swift by cosmic standards. Within 5 years of the Alliance's failed investigation, more than 80% of galactic civilization had adopted some form of dynamic environmental policy. Traditional climate-controlled habitats were being abandoned or converted into museums. Safety-obsessed cultures were evolving into adventure-seeking societies. The galaxy was experiencing what historians would later call the Great Awakening. It's like watching an entire civilization grow up, Dr. Cranklebottom observed during a tour of the newly established colonies in the former forbidden zone of the galaxy. They're discovering what humans have always known, that life is supposed to be lived, not merely survived. The final irony came when humanity received an official apology from the Galactic Council. The apology was delivered by Chairman Vorthak himself during a ceremony held on Earth, in the open air, during what the aliens had learned to call a lovely spring day. "On behalf of the Galactic Council," Vorthak announced, "I formally apologize to the human species for the incredible stupidity of classifying you as catastrophically unsuitable for Deathworld habitation. We now recognize that you were not unsuitable for dangerous environments. You were unsuitable for boring ones." The ceremony concluded with what had become a galactic tradition, a picnic. Thousands of beings from dozens of species gathered on Earth's surface to experience what their ancestors would have considered impossibly dangerous. Eating food outdoors, under an open sky, in an atmosphere that moved and changed according to natural processes. "You know," Dr. Punchbowl said to Ambassador Threshpike as they watched the festivities, "I don't think any of us saw this coming when we started building those artificial habitats." "The best revolutions," Threshpike replied, "are the ones that nobody plans. And the best discoveries are the ones that everybody was too scared to make until somebody showed them how." The galaxy had learned something fundamental about the nature of existence, that safety and satisfaction were not the same thing, that comfort and contentment were not synonymous, and that the universe was much more interesting when you stopped trying to eliminate everything interesting about it. As the picnic continued into the evening, with beings from across the galaxy experiencing their first sunset without protective equipment, Dr. Punchbowl reflected on the cosmic absurdity of it all. Humanity had been banned from Deathworlds for being too dangerous to themselves, and in response, they had accidentally taught an entire galaxy how to live. The universe, as it turned out, had a sense of humor that would have made Douglas Adams proud. The species, too dangerous for dangerous places, had become the galaxy's greatest experts on making dangerous places safe enough to enjoy. And somewhere in the cosmic bureaucracy that governed the fundamental forces of existence, someone was probably filling out a form to officially reclassify the entire concept of safety as a really good way to miss out on everything worthwhile.